Who's excited for my first ever monthly wrap up? I have been waiting a year since I rediscovered my love of reading to be able to just gush about all of the books that I read in a month. Starting off strong because we have 26 books to talk about. Yes, you heard that right, 26 books. And that's because on one day I read 8 books. Let's go ahead and get into it. So I've been thinking a lot about how I want to organize. Don't be fooled by this stack of books. Should I move that? So I've been going back and forth on how I wanted to organize these books in the order that I go over them. I was originally going to do star rating, but I feel like it just makes more sense to organize them in groups of why I read them. If you hear some crinkling in the background, that would be Dory, who discovered a box she's excited to sleep in, but there is plastic in that box and she will eat the plastic. So let me just take care of that situation real fast. No, you decided not to eat the plastic? Wow, such a good girl. Showing such restraint. Can you move, please? You're knocking the camera over. I feel like we should get started talking about the books that I haven't talked about yet on the channel. And those would be books that I read not in a video. Let's start off with the stack of books that I read before that's not true. Let's start off with the books that I read before I even started my channel at the beginning of the year. We started the year off strong with a solid 1 star. Kiss Her Once for Me by Allison Cochran. I read this for Kayla's membership book club. I wanted to love this. I had such high expectations for this. The only contemporary romance I've ever given 5 stars to was a sapphic contemporary romance. So I thought, this is gonna be perfect for my queer heart. We've got tons of bisexual representation. We've got anxiety rep, literally me. And people who don't usually fall in love with contemporary romance, we're putting this in their favorites of the year. A holiday rom-com and their favorites of the year. So I was like, this is gonna be amazing. This book pissed me off so much. I hated how a lot of things were dealt with in here. I hated the main conflict, and I can't talk too much about it because it would be such a spoiler. But the main conflict, this is so the whole setup of this book, I think was good in theory, but posed some issues in execution. The main love interests here, what even are their names? It doesn't even mention her name in the synopsis. Why? So Jack and Ellie on here are the main love interest. Don't even get me started on the fact that neither one of the characters look like either one of these at all. We're not following Jack and Ellie at first. We're actually following Andrew and Ellie because Andrew is the landlord for her coffee shop that she's working at. And Ellie is just really struggling. She originally moved to Portland to pursue her love of graphic design, but that didn't work out. So now she's working at a coffee shop. She's really struggling to make ends meet. Andrew comes in. He's like, hey, I need a wife in order to get my inheritance. So what if we pretended to be engaged and then got married? And you would only have to stay married to me for a year and I'll pay you a bunch of money. And she's reluctant at first, but eventually she's like, okay, cool, I need the money. Then we're also getting flashes of this web comic that Ellie designs that details last Christmas when she met this woman who she just absolutely fell in love with. Kind of what happened in their night and then how things didn't end well with her. Oh, it does say Jack. Okay, yes. And she ends up finding out that when she agrees to fake marry this dude, that the woman that she fell in love with last Christmas Eve who broke her heart is his sister. So then she's hanging out at his family cabin for the holidays for a week with her fake fiance and his sister who she's really in love with, but she can't tell his sister that she's not really his fiance and that it's all fake. The premise of that, fun. The tricky part of it is that the majority of the first part of the book, we spend more time with her and Andrew, and then when they get to their family cabin, Jack and Ellie are doing nothing but fighting because Jack's like, yo, what the fuck? I didn't hear from you again after Christmas Eve and now you're here engaged to my brother. And Ellie's like, yeah, about that, but I can't tell you. And then there's the conflict of why Jack broke her heart last Christmas Eve. That's when this book lost me. I will fight to the end, swearing that Ellie was the least problematic out of all of these characters, but yet somehow got blamed the most by everyone. And just, ugh. And then I was 90% of the way through this book, and I struggled through the end just so I could justifiably give it a 1 star and see if maybe the ending redeemed it to a 2 star or something. The ending just pissed me off even more. So just reinforced my feelings of this absolutely not working for me. And just this one, I don't know if this is common in romance. I know that there's slow burn, and I like a slow burn, which we'll talk about. Slow burn works for me, and we'll talk about how in some books coming up. What doesn't work for me is the 2 main love interests tiffing and fighting for 98% of the book and then only being together the last 5 pages. And I feel like the last few romances that I've read have been like that, and why? It would be different if they were pining for each other that whole time and then you got that build up, but not when they're fighting and mad at each other. So started the year off strong with that one. But then, hang in there, because the next book that I finished in the year was a 5-star and might be one of my favorite books of the year. Probably is one of my favorite books of the year. And that would be The Atlas Paradox. I don't know where the real cover to this went, but as we can see, got a lot of tabs. I loved this book so much. This is the sequel to The Atlas 6, which follows 6 people as they are recruited to protect the Library of Alexandria, which it allegedly burnt down, but it actually didn't burn down, and they've just been keeping it a secret. This is an urban fantasy, and it follows like our world, but magic is real. And there are magicians, and there are people who have certain powers. We are following like 6 very powerful people who are competing for a spot to be a part of this Alexandrian society. Let me tell you, The Atlas 6, arguably nothing happens for the majority of that book until the end. Truly nothing happens in this one, the sequel, for 98% of this book. But I loved it so much because I love the characters. And I am such a character and vibes driven reader that if you make me fall in love with the characters, you can have them doing pretty much nothing and I'm on board with it. And that's what this one was. I know a lot of people don't like this. I know a lot of people who love the Atlas 6 were so disappointed by this book, but I just loved it so much. Loved it even more than the Atlas 6. Makes me want to reread the Atlas 6. Let me just say, Gideon and Libby's character arc, oh, gold. There is a ton of POC representation in the series and polyamory. So if anyone has any other polyamorous fantasy romance recommendations or fantasy with polyamory representation or just polyamory representation in general, let your girl know, because 2 of my favorite books of the year thus far have included that. The next book I finished right after that is The Alloy of Law by Brandon Sanderson. This is the first book in Era 2 of Mistborn. The Mistborn trilogy was my favorite series of the year last year, and this follows the events of that trilogy, but like hundreds of years in the future. And it's kind of like got westerny vibes. It's still fantasy. It works with the same magic system that Mistborn Era 1 does, which is why I love it so much, because that magic system works off of ingesting metals, and certain people can ingest certain metals that give them specific powers. And that trilogy just broke my fucking heart, but in the best way. So I was excited to carry on in that world, but with a completely different set of characters, completely different vibe, and I liked it a lot. It was a 4-star, it didn't hit nearly as hard as Mistborn Era 1 did for me, but I've heard that that's the case, especially with this first book, and that the books just keep getting better in Era 2. So I'm excited to continue carrying on. Brandon Sanderson is an all-time favorite author of mine. I will continue to try to read anything he writes. Next, let's talk about books I read, but not for specific videos, so you haven't really heard me talk a lot about them yet. The first one I read on audiobook, and that is The Only Black Girls in Town. This is a middle grade contemporary story. I never saw their names. I'm so bad with names, okay? So you're just gonna have to forgive me. Alberta and Edie. Okay, yes. It follows our main girl, Alberta, and she is the only black girl in her neighborhood and in her school in general. And she's super excited because a family has just moved into the B&B across the street, and they are black. And they have a daughter who is her age. So she's just excited about the opportunity to have someone in her grade and in her neighborhood who looks like her and who can understand her on a level that her other friends can't. I love the family dynamics in this book. It has so many different levels of a non-traditional family. She has 2 dads. Her and her dad still have a connection to her birth mother, and she kind of comes back into the story. So we get to see that connection there. I actually started reading this because I had bought it during an Audible sale, and I was building my bed, and I wanted something that I could listen to that wasn't like fantasy, that if I didn't need to be like truly paying attention, I could be doing something else and still be able to follow along. So I figured a middle grade contemporary novel would be perfect for that. I ended up giving it like a 3.5 star. I'll probably round that up to a 4-star on Goodreads. Most like middle grade contemporary stories get around like 3 or 4 stars for me. I only think I've given 5 stars to like fantasy middle grades. And those are the ones that like I really love, but I still love reading a good contemporary every once in a while. The next one I picked up because I was in the middle of reading some like heavier fantasy books. January got a little tricky for me because for like a week and a half, almost 2 weeks, I was out of my ADHD medication because there's been a shortage. And no one in my city had it. And it took me a long time to find a pharmacy that finally did have some in stock and then get my prescription transferred over to that pharmacy and get it in time. It was very hard for me to concentrate, and I knew that I couldn't pick up on trying to learn a whole new like language and words and everything that comes along with reading a fantasy book. I needed something that was a little bit easier to follow along with. So I randomly ended up picking up Clown in a Cornfield because I heard that it was campy, slashery, YA thriller vibes, and I was like, okay, this should be pretty easy to like follow along with. I was expecting it to be fine, but I wasn't really sure if I was that into slashers, so I didn't know what to expect fully. I ended up loving this. I gave this 5 stars. This was so much fun. It felt like reading a bad 90s slasher film, but in the best way possible. I don't know how better to explain it. I just feel like it's something that you need to try to see if it's your thing or not, if you're into YA horror thriller vibes. It starts off very slow, kind of the same way as, you know, like slasher movies do, where you're just following people as they're living their lives. Our main girl has like moved to this new town. I believe her name's Quinn. Yeah. Quinn and her father moved to this new town after her mother passes away and her father has taken a new job, and she is trying to figure out how to fit in this new town, and things are weird. And she ends up getting kind of like roped into this group of people who seem to be the troublemakers of the town. But this ends up going in a direction I was not expecting at all in terms of like the themes and what this book has to say, which I didn't expect it to have many themes or things to say, but I was so wrong. I really enjoyed it. Now, the next book I did actually read for a video, but I think at least for now that video idea is on pause. You might end up seeing it come back. I recorded footage for it, but then I was a little burnt out on the idea for that video after reading this book, and I couldn't carry on. So maybe one day you'll see the footage of this, but maybe not. And that is the Final Girl support group. I picked this up for a local book club that no matter what they read, I'm gonna read it because I love the book club so much that I want to go to it. I knew that this probably wasn't my thing. Again, this has that campy slasher over the top vibes, but on a whole other level. This is taking place in a world where like the characters of popular 80s slasher films, the women at the end, the final girl, the girl who survives and then ends up killing her killer, those stories and movies were based off of true events, and we're following the women where that actually happened to them, and they have a support group. It's the support group for final girls. The Final Girl support group.
Poison, the poison for Cusco. The poison chosen specially to kill Cusco. Cusco's poison.
I knew that this got over the top. I knew a lot of people's complaints were that like it was so unbelievable, but I like a good unbelievable horror book, so I thought that this would be really up my alley. The first part of this really worked for me, and then kind of like the last part a little bit, but overall, I just felt like I didn't care. Like there was absolutely no suspense or tension for me. With how much happens in this book, it is like, and it just keeps getting more. It is truly unbelievable, some of the situations that like our characters get into, and the fact that they like live through it is unbelievable, but it's supposed to be, because it's supposed to have that same vibe as an unbelievable 80s slasher film. That wasn't the issue for me. The issue for me was that it just felt so, for how much was happening, I was like, okay, and that's because I didn't really care about any of our characters. So I think the idea was cool, but the execution didn't give me the feelings that I expected it to. So I ended up giving that 2.5 stars. So that covers all of the books that I haven't talked about and probably am not going to talk about here on this channel in another video. The rest of the books I read for a video. You'll already have videos on my thoughts of these books, so I'm not gonna go too in depth of them, but I wanna review them and let you know what I thought. This first set, the video might not be live for it by the time this video goes up yet, but when it is, I'll link it. But it shouldn't be too long after this video, and that is reading fantasy romance books. I am trying to figure out what romance works for me, specifically fantasy romance, because I think that that's the category of romance that I vibe the most with, and I'm trying to figure out what tropes I like, what subgenres I like, and what doesn't work for me. I discovered some very interesting things in that blog. The 3 books I read were Burn for Me by Ilona Andrews. This was the like highlight of it. Ended up giving this book 4 stars. Listen, the cover, never would have picked this up had it not been for the fact that I saw so many people raving about this book on TikTok and on BookTube, and I thought, okay, if you are loving this book so much that even with this awful cover, you're still, like, you are truly just loving the contents. Some books, I'm like, do we love the book, or do we just love the vibes of the cover and the fan art? Let's get real. This one I know is truly just the contents of the book, and I can attest for that. This was such a fun time. If you want a fantasy romance where the fantasy itself stands on its own, it's an urban romance, slow burn, that is angsty and fun and also has incredible family dynamics, pick up this series. But then unfortunately that was kind of the highlight, because the other 2 that I read are Malice and A Touch of Darkness, and neither one of these worked very well for me. I ended up giving Malice 2 stars and A Touch of Darkness 2.5. I will say, shout out to A Touch of Darkness, because this is the only book I've ever run across where the character had the same name as me. Our main girl, her best friend's name is Lexa, and I was super excited, but it also kind of threw me off a little bit. This is a Hades and Persephone retelling. Neon Gods was like one of the first books that I read for fun in a long time a couple of years ago, and I loved the Hades and Persephone vibe of that. So I thought maybe I would love another retelling. No, it was fine, but I already couldn't tell you the majority of the plot of this book. And I'm fine with that if we got like good smut in it too, because I understand that like this is probably not something you're reading a lot for the plot, but the smut I hated. The red is like back to back to backs. I don't know if you can see that, but it's like it didn't happen until the final third, and then it would be like a page and then it was over, and then it would happen again and again and again. And I think I figured out I would prefer for it to be less frequent but more nuanced and last more than a page, than it be like all of a sudden they're just having a bunch of sex, but we're just getting like little glimpses of it. Not my vibe. So then I thought maybe the issue is that the only romance I've ever read that I really loved, like contemporary romance, was sapphic. So maybe I need to pick up a sapphic fantasy romance. So then I took to TikTok, started searching through, asking the girlies, what are some sapphic fantasy romance recommendations? And over, Malice kept coming up. And I was like, perfect. I've seen this cover so many times, I'm in. This is a Sleeping Beauty retelling. This has so many amazing reviews, so I feel like I could recommend it to people and just know that it didn't work for me personally. I gave this one 2 stars. One of these I gave 2 stars, one I gave 2.5. Either way, somewhere in that realm. I just think fairy tale retellings aren't my thing. And I knew the first like 40 pages into this book that the style I didn't think I was gonna vibe with as much, but I thought maybe it would change. I wanted this to get darker. It's a Sleeping Beauty retelling, but we're following the villain. The villain is the main character, so I just wanted a little bit more. Oh, and then another book that I read for a vlog that's not out yet, but will be at some point, is Vicious by V.E. Schwab. I also read this for Katie's Patreon book club, which I need to figure out when it is, because I like sped read it trying to get it in by the end of this month so that I could attend that book club. And here's the thing, is I never would have picked up Vicious just based off of the synopsis alone. It didn't sound like anything I would be vibing with. I do recommend that if you're going into this book, don't read the whole synopsis. I always think that synopsis give too much away, but this one I really feel like gives away plot twist up until like the halfway point of the book. I loved that I didn't know some of those things. Like I was surprised when I went through to review the synopsis, when I was like halfway through to see what I could talk about and what I couldn't, that so much was included in there. Just know for me, the side characters I loved, but the 2 main characters, and they're supposed to be unlikable characters. We're following like the villains of the stories, these guys that think that they're doing good, but like we don't agree with many of their decisions. There is a side that you're clearly supposed to root for. My side was the side characters. That was the side I was rooting for. That's all I'm gonna say about that one. When the video goes live that it's in, I'll link that up here. Now, books that I read for videos that you will have already seen. Oh, it's 2 stacks of 8 books. That worked out perfectly. The first set of 8 is Sean McGuire's Wayward Children series. I read this for the vlog where I read all of these in 24 hours in anticipation for the newest release, which is Lost in the Moment and Found. This is a series of fantasy horror novellas that follows children who have been to different worlds. They find these random doors when they're kids, they open them up, see what's on the other side, and it's like a completely different world that is supposed to be like perfect for them. But there are so many amazing discussions about childhood, losing your childhood innocence, how society raises children and the expectations we put on them. These books are very diverse. I would say, even though we're following kids, these are like adult books. They could also be read as young adult books, but they're not middle grade by any means. Like they're dark. I love them so much. This is one of my favorite series. It made my top list last year. I think it was number 2, possibly. These books just have such a special place in my heart that I wanted to reread them for this upcoming book. If you want more in-depth thoughts on the rest of them, definitely go watch that vlog. 7 out of the 8 books were rereads. I'd already read the whole series and I was rereading it for the new one, so this was my only new read. I gave all of these 5 stars except for one of them. If you are into fantasy or horror at all, definitely recommend that you check these out. My last set of 8 books that I read for one video were all of these books that I read for reading Kayla's favorites of the year. If you haven't seen that video already, I read all of the books from Books and Lala's top 10 books of the year. She was one of the first YouTubers that got me back into reading and really helped me to discover where my reading tastes lie. That vlog went so well. There were some surprises. Okay, I don't want to spoil anything, but I'll just quickly run through the books that I did read. The first is Daughter of the Moon Goddess. This is the first book in a YA fantasy duology that is following our main character, Xing Yin, who has been living in this kind of like mansion castle with her mom, the Moon Goddess, and she ends up having to flee this kingdom that she's been living in with her mom since she was born, and she ends up having to flee her home and sets off on a journey to try to save herself and her mom. This is such a recommendable YA fantasy, especially since it's a duology and the second book has already come out, plus these covers, stunning. The next one, which is probably like the one that I could recommend the most widely to pretty much everyone to read, is Kindred by Octavia E. Butler. This follows our main character Dana, who is a woman in the 1970s. She's in her 20s and she's just living her life when one day she is transported back in time to a plantation in the 1820s where she witnesses this boy drowning in a lake. But her fate is intrinsically tied to this boy's fate, who is destined to grow up to be this plantation owner, and her stays in the 1800s start to grow longer and longer, and she just has to figure out kind of how to navigate that situation and figure out how much of an impact she can have on this life without directly impacting her life and her fate in a way where she wouldn't exist anymore. Gorgeously written. The audiobook is incredible. Absolutely recommend. For this vlog, I also read The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin. This might end up being one of my favorite books of the year. High fantasy, kind of has post-apocalyptic vibes. This is the other fantasy that has polyamorous representation that chef's kiss. Incredible. I've already carried on in the series. Next, I read How High We Go in the Dark. This gave me Sea of Tranquility vibes. So if you've read that before, I think you'll really like this. It is a series of short stories that all end up kind of interconnecting, but follow different people as they are impacted by this environmental plague. I ended up really loving this, actually more so than I thought that I would. It is heavy. It made me cry, but so good. Then I read Jamila Green Ruins Everything. This kind of gives me Finley Donovan vibes, and it follows our main girl Jamila Green, who is trying to rekindle her relationship with God because she wants him to help her out with her book becoming a bestseller. And she ends up in a mosque where she meets Ibrahim, and some things ensue. Ibrahim ends up being wrongly accused by the CIA of being a terrorist, and Jamila has to set out on a quest to rescue him. It is wild and over the top, and the humor is not going to be for everyone, but I just loved it. Now, the last three books are books that I had complicated feelings on from that vlog, and that is The Paulbearers Club by Paul Tremblay, which I only have on ebook, Death in Her Hands, and The Book of the Most Precious Substance. I don't want to give anything away because there were some interesting realizations with all of those books, but I'm glad that I read them because I learned a lot about my reading taste and also about my reading taste in comparison to Kayla's. So now I feel more confident in which books I should read from her that she loves. Yes, that was all 26 books that I read in January. I cannot guarantee that I will be reading that many books moving forward. Usually I read somewhere between like 15 and 20 books in a month. But keeping in mind that 8 of those were the Wayward Children novellas that I read in one day. So without those, it would have been more along the lines of like 18, 20 books. Overall, this was a really good month for me. I know that some of like my data is skewed because of my rereads of the Wayward Children series, which I already knew I loved, and most of those, 7 out of 8 are 5 stars. So that's like gonna up my average. But also with that Kayla reading vlog, I found some real winners. And from the books that I read that I didn't love as much, I figured out some important things about my taste in reading and in books and tropes that I like and ones that I don't, that I think is going to help me make better decisions about books in the future. And that's like what this is all about. I'm still in the middle of figuring out exactly what kind of books that I love and what doesn't vibe with me as much. So I'm okay with some books that don't work because they just teach me a little bit. Overall, I have just loved this first month on BookTube. I was really nervous going into this. I don't know if you know this. If you made it all the way to this video, you watched me ramble through my terrible explanations of 26 synopses of books when I am the worst at explaining synopses because I never read them. You probably must enjoy me on some level if you treaded through me explaining all of those books to you. I can talk a lot more about why I picked up a book and what I loved about it than I can about what actually happened. And God knows I never remember any of the characters' names, which we already know at this point. My point being, if you made it all this way, I feel like I can talk more about like the sentimental stuff. I was actually kind of nervous to join BookTube because I didn't want reading to be something I felt like I needed to do for a job. Because if you don't already know, I'm actually already a full-time content creator, but I make personal finance content, which is like, I know, very different from book content, but that is what I've been doing the last 2 years, is creating like shame-free, accessible, relatable personal finance content on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram. So I was already very comfortable talking to a camera and all of that, but my thing is I'm not as like used to talking about books. I have book clubs in my town that I go to, but a lot of the books I talk about is like just talking to people online in like the comment section on BookTube videos. And because social media and creating content was already my full-time job, I didn't want this to feel like something that was a chore or something I had to do because I am such a mood reader and such an advocate for reading as a source of joy. Like, I rediscovered my love of reading in 2022, so I still want it to be something that I love. And it was also just kind of scary because I already built up this huge platform in a completely different niche that's starting completely over on a whole other channel with a whole other different niche of audience and people to connect with. It was kind of really scary. And it's just been amazing so far. Being able to interact with all of you, seeing your comments, your support, being able to talk about books, is just, it brings me so much joy, which is exactly what I needed. I needed to reconnect with the joy of social media and connecting with people and talking about things that we love. So I'm just incredibly thankful for this channel and for all of you. I have some really cool ideas for videos that I am so looking forward to. I love that I now have an outlet to talk about books and not annoy the people in my life that don't read at all and don't understand what I'm talking about when I talk about all the books that I read. So this has just been so much fun. I'm incredibly thankful that you all are here. If you made it all the way to the end of this video, leave me like a camera or video camera emoji down below. I can't wait to see what the rest of the year holds. Thank you all so much for being here, and I'll see you next time.